Mutts. I am Devin Shepherd.
And I'm David B. Jacobs.
And we are Cadaver Dogs. This is our April episode. Thank God it's frickin' spring. Am I right, David?
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be raining all week. Yeah.
Oh, well then, never mind.
April showers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's how we'll look at today. It's the day before Easter. We'll just think about it as April showers. Today we have a special guest for you, writer-director Emily Bennett. Her films have screened at festivals such as Sitges, Fantasia, Fantastic, Brooklyn, Film Quest, Grimmfest, ByFan, Screamfest, Horrible Imaginings, Holly Shorts, Salem Horror, and Telluride. Basically, all over the frickin' globe, she screened her films, which is really exciting. Her debut feature, Alone with You, debuted at Fantastic Fest and can be seen on Shudder. If you haven't watched it yet, what the hell are you doing? People are writing about this film like crazy. It is making all the top lists. Made all the top lists. It's still making top lists, and it came out, a year ago? Bennett is repped by SpectraVision, and special little tidbit here, she has an upcoming horror feature, which she co-wrote and co-directed, and David actually script supervised.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
And you were awesome.
Thank you.
Welcome, Emily. We're so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, guys, and great to see you again, David.
Great to see you again. It's been a couple months.
What, not me?
Well, both of you. I just feel like I'm sitting in the house where David spent so much time. So I think the house has certainly missed you, David. And then Devin, we have to get you up here at some point. We'll do like a haunted country retreat.
Oh, that would be awesome.
I've heard so many great things about this house because you have a nice collection of horror, I've heard.
I can't take any credit for that. That is all my husband, Justin Brooks.
I was taking pictures of all of this crazy horror memorabilia all over the house and just sending it to Devin. Like, look at this crazy house. They have a giant pumpkin head. It's amazing.
We have a life-size pumpkin head in the barn beside our life-size predator statue. And I truly believe that Justin needed to move to the country out of New York City just to house his horror memorabilia because he has so much.
Every time I thought I had seen all the memorabilia, I looked into a corner and saw something else.
Yeah, that's how it feels living here too.
You have to have a few things in that collection, though, at this point, right?
I do. Mine are mostly, I'm such a minimalist, though. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. I went to school as an actor in London, and then I moved to New York, and then Chicago and New York. So I've never owned very much. I feel like if I have my laptop, I'm kind of okay. But I do have, let's see, what do I have here? Mostly like Blu-rays and like movie posters. I actually, David, I can't tell you what it is, or I can't tell your listeners what it is, but I did frame something from the film that we just shot and that I'm in post on now. So that's going to go on the wall too. And that will become its own horror memorabilia. Sweet. With us. So I'll tell you on the break.
Cool.
Well, we're so excited to have Emily. And one thing I did want to bring up early on, because you had already mentioned moving out of the city and into this house. And your film Alone with You, I remember, was filmed in your New York City apartment. So I just thought it was an interesting, especially for this topic, the two films that you're between are like the city film and then the country film that you have coming up, and the horror that differs between the two.
That's so true. And it actually has a lot to do with the films we're talking about today. Just talking about, Alone with You couldn't be more of a city film if it tried. We were literally in lockdown. I never say New York is like a character in the film because I don't. It's a beautiful backdrop, but no, you're exactly right. Like the next film is very much based in the country, and it's interesting where you find community and how you find community in different places. I think personally, I fit somewhere between like the distant country and like the city. But I don't know. I think my horror community is my like overall community in life, though.
Yeah, I agree there. And I You're hitting on a lot of key things that we're going to explore today. And maybe in our conversation, we'll bring out a little bit that can give you some insight into Emily's recent work and upcoming work. And you can view it through a different lens, which is really exciting. Well, let's go ahead and get started for today. And we'll hear more about Emily and her work after we talk about our first movie.
Yeah. So, Devin, you want to introduce the first film?
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming for them. Tina has these awful nightmares of a man with a burnt face and knives for fingers. Safe to say, she doesn't want to be alone at night. So she invites her BFF Nancy to keep her company. But things get even stranger when the girls realize they're dreaming of the same man. Could it mean anything? Supernatural suspicion is disrupted by sexual desire when the girls' boyfriends, Rod and Gwen, knock at the door. Tina is whisked away to the bedroom, Nancy is more chaste, and after what sounds like a very successful session, Tina falls asleep. Rod, Tina's boyfriend, is then awoken to Tina's screams as she fights off an invisible attacker. With nothing he can do, Tina dies violently in front of him. Everyone thinks Rod murdered Tina, but Nancy knows there is something far more sinister at play here. Her nightmares of the man with the burnt face grow more intense. She believes that this man is real, that he murdered Tina, and that he's coming back to get her and her friends. Rod is next to die, hung in his jail cell. Then Glenn turned into blood soup. Nancy is left alone to fight, and all she can do is stay awake. After watching her daughter suffer trauma after trauma, Nancy's mother breaks down. She knows something, and the guilt is too much to bear. Years before, Nancy's mom and a few neighborhood parents killed a man, Fred Kreuger. He was a child murderer who got off on a technicality, and the parents wanted justice. Now, Nancy knows Freddy is seeking revenge by killing the children of those who wronged him, using their dreams as his domain. But what if Nancy brought him out of his domain? In a climactic showdown, Nancy faces Kreuger, pulling him out of her dream and into the real world, where she can hurt him. But Freddy captures Nancy's mother and disappears. Did Nancy defeat him, or was this all one big nightmare? This is A Nightmare on Elm Street, written and directed by Wes Craven, our king. Can I say that?
Of course.
All hail Craven.
I think this is only the second time we've covered a Wes Craven movie, but the previous was New Nightmare, so...
He always has so much to talk about in his films. I mean...
Yeah. Totally. And a lot of our New Nightmare conversation would apply here too, probably, and how we were discussing. It was largely about like his theory of horror movies and how horror is used as a means of confronting your real world fears in a safe environment and all these things, and it's really neat. But in this movie, we have a whole other host of things to discuss. So to start us off, I want to ask, why do you guys think this movie needs to be set in the suburbs, or doesn't need to be set in the suburbs? Could it have been set in a city or in a country like one of Emily's movies, or
It's either or in my movies. I mean, I guess I can speak to that. I think what I'm kind of seeing in this, Nightmare on Elm Street sets up a kind of utopian ideal, like the American dream, right? And I think, I always think of like, I love non-American filmmakers making American films because they can often look at America as a whole and be able to see things that we can't necessarily see as, I mean, I'm American and my ideals and perspective are colored by my upbringing. Whereas I feel like Wim Wenders, like Paris, Texas, that is such an interesting view of America and Americana. And I feel like the suburbs is such an American thing. And I love that Wes Craven set this in the suburbs because that became the kind of ideal, right? We came out of the 50s. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs in the Bible Belt in Charleston, South Carolina. Like that was everything. You were told that you lived in a kind of perfect world. And I think it is a perfect setting to have this, you know, the American dream, and then to have a nightmare unfold.
Yeah. And we've talked about this a lot on this podcast of how the 80s specifically wanted to recreate that 1950s idealist nuclear family, good teenagers, parents who are together, you know, people who are not having sex before marriage, all this like very wholesome life attitude. And I think with that, the suburbs is often seen, as Emily said, as that utopia, as that, ideal family life. And I think with Wes Craven setting this film in the suburbs, he wants to poke directly at that idealism and say, you know what, this life that we dream of, there's a nightmare aspect to it, quite literally.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, going back to Halloween, the slashers have often been set in suburban environments. That's a little bit of a trope of the genre. And in our episode on Friday the 13th, we discussed how like slashers are somewhat a response to the culture that led to like Ronald Reagan. We get to say Ronald Reagan again. Although Ronald Reagan actually compared A Nightmare on Elm Street to the Carter administration. That was an actual quote by him. So I love that he just completely missed the point of the movie.
You sent that article to me and I laughed my head off because I was like, does Reagan know what he's talking about?
But yeah, in the, don't do drugs, don't have sex, like it is all of these ideals that Reagan and his administration were propping up, and the people who voted for Reagan were propping up even before he came into office. And yeah, I love that American dream that Emily was talking about. The idea of the suburbs is surprisingly recent, like I think somewhere around the turn of the 20th century, that it was a response to like all the cities were growing, and then basically commuters established these communities just outside of them. And it's weird because we think of it as such a key part of life, and it's not. Like literally the lawns themselves are fake. Like that's not what grass looks like.
Well, to build off of that, sorry to jump in here, but yeah, I think you're right. The suburbs were an idea of escaping this city life, and mainly what it was rooted in was people thought the city became too much of a sinful place, right?
Mm.
They sought outside of the city to build a community that they thought they would have more, yeah, just like better morals, a better life in. It's always the grass is literally greener, David. Like, it's chasing that golden dream that we all have. And so I think that fits really well into, as Emily put it, the American dream.
No, totally. I love that the suburbs are so new and they come up in horror all the time.
Yeah.
Poltergeist, Halloween, like everything that we kind of look back onto in this horror heyday. I mean, the suburbs, it is a kind of utopian ideal. We are going to escape the sins and the noise and the dirt and the grime of the city. But I think with that, like you said, the grass, it's not real. Like it's not natural.
Yeah.
And it becomes this kind of utopian, idealistic form of repression. And I think that, I think ultimately the human psyche can't actually cope ultimately with that level of repression, right? I think once you try to give the white picket fence to everyone, and you have like the cul-de-sac and all the kids, and you have all the dad has the car and mom has the vacuum cleaner and all of this like, nonsense that we were like fed from the 50s to the 80s, the Reagan era. Ultimately, the individual self, like the subconscious, I think I, as the individual, know that my subconscious and my actual self, I feel that I can't necessarily reach that super ego, that social self, that ideal. And so innately there becomes a kind of subconscious like mess that happens in that. And the only way, if you're striving to be the cheerleader, the jock, the perfect wife, the perfect husband, ultimately you can't. You might be able to control everything in your life, but you can't control your dreams and you can't control your subconscious. And I think that's what Wes Craven is really tapping into here. And I love Wes because he too was, I was raised in the Bible Belt. He was raised in a very religious family, and with religion, while I think good things can come from organizations, a lot of bad comes from that too. But I think personally, growing up in a very religious society myself, I found myself feeling very othered because I would have nightmares or I would have thoughts that didn't align with what I was taught in Bible school and things like that. And so you start to feel very separate from all of these people that you assume are like perfect, right? And you're the one that's not. And so I think that's what Nightmare on Elm Street really, that's why this film means so much to me, because I feel like it speaks to kind of my upbringing and my trying to figure out who am I in this perfect society.
Yeah, I love that read. And if we can stay on religion for a second, because as you said, Wes grew up in a religious household, and there is a lot of religious imagery throughout this film. Do we think that this film says anything about religion? Do you see that? Do you see a statement or a theory presented in the movie?
I think it has to be. I mean, it's in the song. Once you phrase coming for you, 3, 4, better lock the door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix, and that's like the first thing that happens in the movie too. After Tina wakes up from her nightmare, she jumps up, and in that very first shot, there's a cross right behind her that is like brightly lit and perfectly framed. It's in the background, but it stands out in the background. And then at the end of the scene, she turns around and she grabs the cross, and it's like she's reaching to it for protection. And then when Tina is killed in her dream, she says, "Oh God," and Freddy says, "This is God," gesturing to his knife claws. Tina, even with her being the tropier has sex before marriage character, is also the religious character in the movie, is what it seems. And yet she's still killed. I think personally my read is that the song is a lie, and the song is specifically listing things that will not defend you against Freddy, that it's all in vain, which is why it keeps escalating with each step. So better lock the door. That's not gonna do anything. He's not gonna come in. Grab your crucifix. Religion is not effective against him in this movie. It is in later ones.
Yeah.
Stay up late. You've got to sleep eventually. Never sleep again. That's impossible. You have to sleep.
No, I love that. I mean, Nancy too, you know, in that classic, he's coming out of the ceiling, that beautiful shot when he's like pressing himself, like it's so good, like just practical effects. It's just,
yeah.
Oh, I love it. I could watch it all day. But then, you know, she turns over and then puts her crucifix like above her and knocks on the ceiling, and to show that it's, you know, solid, but to also, I feel like the crucifix here, and I think you're totally right, David, you can't shut the door. He will still get in because you have to go to sleep, and you might grab your crucifix, but in a way it's a totem. It's a good luck charm that won't ultimately protect these kids from what they need to face. I think religion, you know, in the confusion of being a teenager, you know, Tina seeing her mom kind of, I guess, sleep around, or I guess that's like indicated in the first, like her mom comes in and she's like, "Are you okay?" And she's got that like weird guy who's just like, "Come back to bed." And she's like, "Okay." And I guess it's indicating that Tina's mom might be living in sin. Who knows? But then Nancy's mom, you know, she has a drinking problem. And yet, like, they're all in their safe homes. And I feel like these things of like safe locked doors, have a crucifix on the wall, you know, we're doing all the things we are told to do. And yet you can't keep your subconscious at bay. Like the traumas from your past will find you eventually. And I think it's finally confronting that it is the only answer. That should be what the kids are singing about. Like,
yeah.
talk about your feelings.
It even ties into what we were saying about the suburbs, that the suburbs are created as this idea of security, that you're safe here. The bad things all happen in the city. They don't happen here in the suburbs. And it's a lie. Just like with grab your crucifix, it's okay. But if you're religious, this ghost, specter, demon thing is not going to be able to kill you, except no, he totally is.
Yeah.
And ironically, he is kind of born of religion. That's getting more into the sequels, which we don't want to talk too much into, but I do just want to point out that it is established in one that Wes Craven did write a draft on, that his mother was a nun. So
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I just rewatched that one too.
it's so good.
It's so good. So good.
And everything you're saying about how people are reacting, I think this is very much a societal thing that we're seeing at this time. The 70s were pretty violent as portrayed by the media. I mean, there was the
Yep.
Vietnam War. We talked about this a lot. This is well known. So people were reacting to that. The sexual revolution, the Watergate scandal really left people distrusting their government. So things are kind of nuts in the 70s. So when we're transferring over into the 80s, we're seeing this huge increase of evangelism and religion coming back into the forefront and that taking over the media, kind of this big swing, grab your crucifix in order to put a Band-Aid on all the horrors and the trauma specifically that we experienced in the 70s. I did want to pull out one thing that was going on at this time. So the Satanic Panic was starting on the upswing when this movie was made. Specifically happening around this time was this crazy daycare sex abuse hysteria. But I think this goes to what you were saying, David, on the suburbs are not always the safe place. This was a thing happening in the early 80s, I think starting in 82 and reaching a big height in 83 with the McMillan preschool scandal. Do you guys know anything about this?
The McMillan? I don't know that one specifically. No. Tell us.
McMartin. I'm sorry. The McMartin
McMartin.
preschool. So it was a preschool where the supervisors were starting to be accused of, and I'm sorry, skip ahead if you don't want to hear this, everybody, abusing and molesting the children under their care. And they started interviewing the kids and more truths came out, truths, quote, truths of them being molested or abused at this daycare center. And it became this huge, crazy thing across the world. America really started, this is where we're really starting to see parents kind of hold on to their children and start to worry that everyone is out to get their kids. Years and years later in the 90s, we found out that it was all true and that the kids were coerced into these confessions. Horrible, absolutely horrible. But we're seeing this right before A Nightmare on Elm Street, which I think does feed into the suburban, the religion, but also the parent-child relationship in this film specifically.
Sorry, did you say it was all true?
No, it was not all true.
It was not all true.
It was all
Okay.
faked. Sorry, did I fuck that up? It was none of it was real.
Yeah, I mean is that because I know that in A Nightmare on Elm Street, in the original script that they were about to film, Freddy Kreuger was himself a child molester.
Mhm.
And then there was some high profile case around the same time. So they took that out and they made it subtext instead of text. And they don't explicitly say that he's a child molester, although he obviously is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was this case because this was 1983 was when the trials, I think, started.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the subtext that the horrible, atrocious, no good remake made text. You know, there's the phone scene when he sticks his tongue into Nancy's face and says, "I'm your boyfriend now." There's the part where he's attacking her in the bathtub and while she's naked and vulnerable. Like there are obviously sexual themes going on here that are heavily implied in all of the Nightmare movies.
No, absolutely. Well, and I think talking about that daycare scandal, I do vaguely remember reading something about that. And that kind of reminds me, that whole satanic panic and that panic that's happening in a growingly conservative America during this time. I feel like, the adults in this film and in all of these satanic panic cases, whether they were true or not, and a lot of them just were not true, it does give the upright citizens of America a clear bad guy. Right? It became this kind of Band-Aid for everyone of saying, yeah, but that's not me. That's the bad guy. And it became very clear whereas I love 70s horror because things are a bit more muddled and complicated in a way. Like Texas Chainsaw, like the kids shouldn't be on their land, quite frankly. I think I'm a Leatherface apologist, fan, ally. I don't know. But I feel like in the 80s, I don't know, like the Reagan era, satanic panic, like we needed, as a society, we needed to clean up the mess, the dust, and the blood, of the 70s horror. We needed to be like, nope, we're in a nice little camp, in the summer, and like kids will be kids and adults are adults, and I feel like everyone had their kind of cookie cutter place, and satanic panic gave all of like the parents in America a clear bad guy. You know, they got to be like, well, that's not me. I go to church and I'm on the PTA board and I have two lovely kids, two and a half kids and a nuclear family and a dog and a white picket fence. And I feel like it is a kind of societal form of gaslighting in a way, of like telling everyone there is a bad guy out there. There is a bad guy in your dreams. There is a bad guy in the basement that we hid away, you know, but I don't know, in a way that is in everybody. I just think in the 80s, people couldn't look at the badness that might exist in themselves and actually do the work that we all have to do as human beings and like confront our fears and confront our darker selves. I think that's really healthy. And I think that's why I love horror. I love confronting really difficult things in myself. You know, I go to therapy. I like dredging up. I love dreaming. I love writing these horrific stories because I think it helps me as a person. Whereas I think as a society in the 80s, it just didn't seem to be the way of things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I have a question, because obviously now we know that so much of the Satanic Panic was not truthful. It was most all of these allegations that were coming out around the time were just not real, that the people were murdering children in like satanic rituals or whatever. How much doubt was there at the time? Like, would Wes Craven have known that it was overblown? Would he have thought that it was all just real? Because I feel like there's some elements in this movie that are kind of calling out an overreaction as well. I mean, Freddy is murdered in a lynch mob. Freddy is still definitely guilty, though. There's no question about his guilt. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there was definitely enough for people to be like, stop clutching your pearls, you people. Like, these cows are just dying. They're not like dying from a satanic ritual. Like, I think that's, and I agree with you, David. I think it's very relevant here in Wes Craven's films that people are posing a doubt on the satanic panic. I mean, we are always looking at history through a lens of like the parts that are most reported on, which is, you know, at the media at this time was very much reported on just the negative things going on in the world and not really challenged enough. Where it was challenged was through art, and I think a lot through horror.
Yeah, horror is very often ahead of the mainstream in painting issues that no one else is willing to talk about.
Yeah. I do, speaking of challenging, I do want to challenge one statement that you said, Emily, which was the clear bad guy. So I think Nightmare does something interesting where the parents do something that is kind of really horrible, where they murder Freddy. So I do question like what we're trying to explore there. Is there a clear bad guy? How are we supposed to feel about the parents' actions?
Oh, I think them saying that Freddy is the only bad guy is absolutely them trying to reason with themselves of what they did, because ultimately they killed someone. Like, he might be a terrible person, but they are murderers. And I think the 80s, everyone tried to say that I'm not the bad guy. But at the end of the day, everyone has to live with their own actions, their own choices in life. And these parents obviously did something horrible. And a lot of them couldn't live with themselves. Like Nancy's mom drinks. Tina's mom, I guess it's suggested that she sleeps around. You know, I feel like Johnny Depp's parents, I feel like they seem to be the most normal perhaps, but there's difficulty in that household as well. And I feel like they all inevitably have to deal with what they've done, like the sin that they've committed. So I don't think there is a clear bad guy. I think they are guilty too. And they went outside of, you know, the law, society, you know, he was let off. So their society, their culture, you know, their perfect world, they couldn't basically imprison this man because there was a problem. And so they went outside of the law and the outside of the social order, and they enacted revenge themselves. And I think when they go outside of that, that is a transgression against the American dream, the American ideal, because they are murderers now. And so I think then to reason with themselves of what they did to deal with their sins, they have to build their white picket fence even whiter and even more perfect, you know?
Yeah. So I love the fact that in response to everything you just said, that Nancy's dad is also a cop. And
Yes.
if you don't mind me going a little tinfoil hat conspiracy theory for a minute, the line that Nancy's mom gives is something like, someone signed a paper in the wrong place and therefore Freddy got off. She doesn't give any more details. We don't know what she's talking about. We don't know if she's overblowing it or anything, but we do know that this sounds like a cop made a mistake and Nancy's dad is a cop. So what if Nancy's dad is the reason that Freddy did not get convicted?
It's interesting. I guess I kind of almost want to push it further, and there's no support to this, but what if he did it on purpose? This is all
Mm.
conjecture. This
Yeah, it's
has no
complete
standing.
conjecture.
Yeah.
But it does line up. I don't know if you would have done it on purpose, but it definitely lines up that it might be his fault, because then like he and his wife, who are divorced now, which I've never realized in the like 10 times that I've seen this movie until Devin pointed it out to me while we were outlining. um
Oh my God, they are.
I just
David was like, "No, he's just busy because that's how parents are."
as a child of divorced parents, went right over my head.
Mine too. And me too. Damn.
But yeah, the idea that this is kind of what called them to action makes sense to me. It's not just that this child murderer slash molester got off. It's that he got off because he fucked up and now they've got to fix that. And I mean,
Mm.
do they fix that? Like, not really, because then Freddy just comes back anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even worse. And
Yeah.
visits their children, goes for where they are the most vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Into the minds of their children. Yeah. Oh, I love that theory.
Yeah. I wrestle a lot with what Wes is trying to say in like how we should feel about the parents murdering Freddy. Like, should we be, yes, the parents were
Mm.
justified. This makes sense. Freddy is pure evil. He's just coming back after these kids as basically the devil. He's a godless soul. Or are we supposed to live more in the gray area of what is actually right and wrong? Like, should the parents have followed the law? And is the parents' punishment now just because they broke the law that now they are being tortured
Well,
once more?
it's their kids who are being punished more than them. So,
The parents are pretty punished in this movie. They are all, as Emily said, they're all kinds of fucked up.
yeah, and Nancy's mom is killed as well, but she's the only adult who's like directly targeted by Freddy. And even then, it's only after Nancy brings him to the real world, which makes me think that he probably can't attack parents in their dreams. I think his powers might be limited to children, since that was his targets in life.
Interesting.
That's how I've always read it. That's why he targets the children and not the parents. He probably can't target the parents, or he just likes targeting children because he's a fucked up person.
Well, and totally, David. And I feel like kids, they are closer to their primal selves than adults are, if that makes sense. Like, they're closer to their impulses and their, I know, going to drama school as an actor, I remember a great teacher once telling me, don't worry about seeking out life experiences. You don't need to bungee jump. You don't need to like go through everything in life to act, because by the time you're 2, you've experienced every single human emotion. And kids are crazy. Like, they're crazy. They run around, they scream, they cry, like they change on a dime, but they're feeling everything so intensely. And I feel like that primal, and that's why we find kids fascinating, I think, because there's no filter. They're not aware of what they should be doing yet. And so I think that's why the children in this film, like the younger generations, are easier targets for Freddy, because they don't know everything they're supposed to be doing yet. They're still exploring, they're still, hooking up, and they're trying to figure out who they are, like teenagers do. I think it's in that liminal space of being a teenager, that's where Freddy comes. That's where they're the most vulnerable.
I love that. And specifically that they don't know what they want to do yet, implying that, as you grow, you learn not only the laws, but also the social and cultural constructs around our lives. And that's kind of heartbreaking because it kind of shows that, like, kids really dream big, and they believe in so much and have so much faith, and we kind of see that break down through the rules that are presented, and they make children feel shame, and they kind of chip them and break them down to be in sort of this structured everyday person, which we see represented in the adults, right? But specifically looking on that for how Freddy ends up being defeated, question mark, at the end of this
Mm.
film, Nancy takes away his power by saying, like, I don't believe in you anymore, and turns her back on him. I think you're right, Emily, that, like, this is her now. She had all this power to dream and have faith in something, and she hones in on that power. Whereas the adults, like, can't believe in anything anymore, and therefore can't believe in Freddy. Did that make sense? I kind of got lost in my own
Mm,
thoughts there.
Yeah, no, completely.
yeah.
I think the ending leads me back to a lot of our new nightmare conversation about weaponizing fear and learning how to fight fear and confronting the horrors of the world and sort of accepting them, but also just preparing yourself for them.
Mm. No, I think that's wonderful. And I think Nancy, the reason she succeeds is she stops thinking the door, the crucifix, the totems will help.
Mm,
Ultimately, she has to be the one to face Freddy herself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is that gray area that Wes is kind of driving towards with the theme of this. And I'm going to be super pretentious and bring up something that Lynn Shay says, the lovely Lynn Shay,
perfect.
in her class. Because in every horror film, if any teacher is teaching anything, it has to do with the theme of the movie,
Of course.
obviously, every single time. And so, she's teaching Shakespeare, which I'm a nerd for. And she's teaching about this, a little about Julius Caesar, but really keeps hammering in Hamlet, right? And it's, Hamlet is the classic teenager, sulky, doesn't know what to do, avenge his father, but like he can't. And then, that's the entire play. And it's like a perfect play, but that's basically the gist of it. Like, should I or should I not do this thing? And the part that she's referencing in the classroom is a conversation that Hamlet has with his friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And he says, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me, it is a prison. And he goes on to say, oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space were it not that I have bad dreams. He's basically saying I could do anything. I could rule the world. I could have anything, but I have bad dreams. And it's those dreams and that subconscious that can't let him escape this prison, right? That's what the parents are living in this film. They're living in a prison that they constructed, that they've done this terrible thing, but they can't face themselves. They have to pretend that they're good, and they will continue to suffer in alcoholism and broken relationships, and they're not dealing with themselves. And so thank you for letting me be pretentious and rant about Hamlet for a second.
We are
Um,
so pretentious on this show. It's fine.
I'm so pretentious. I'm so sorry, guys.
We
I'm just
all
such a
are. I love
Shakespeare
Shakespeare.
nerd. Oh my God. He's the best horror writer, truly. But Hamlet basically says, I could do literally anything if I didn't have these nightmares. And like that speaks obviously to the entire thrust of this film, I think. And it's why Nancy is successful, because she's like, you know what? I do have a shadow self. I do have an id, like aside from my ego. I have dark nightmares and secrets, but I'm going to face them. I'm going to be unlike my parents' generation, and I'm going to face my fears head on. And that's why she succeeds.
As her mom says, you face things, Nancy. That's what you do.
That's right.
There is one wrinkle in this that I have to point out, which is that Nancy doesn't really succeed, that Freddy's still alive at the end. Or
Yeah, let's
alive.
talk about that.
I know. Were there a few different endings to this too?
Yeah.
Wes Craven did not want that to be the ending. He wanted it to have the happy ending where Nancy does what she does and then she gets out and everything's back to normal and things are good. And then Bob Shea, the producer, was like, yeah, no. Freddy's got to come back at the end, and then that's when you get the whole car thing, and it's really confusing. I think
We
the
need a
ending is weird.
sequel. This is what it's based on. We need a sequel, guys.
Yeah, but just to ask, so Wes ultimately did wanted to have a happy ending for
Yes,
Nancy.
he did.
Yeah,
Oh,
which
I
makes
wish.
sense.
I love knowing his initial intent, because
Yeah.
I think that's what he meant, and that, knowing about his upbringing, religion didn't ultimately answer all of his questions. And I think this original ending, I wish we could see like a director's cut of that.
Yeah. Oh, break my heart.
I read an article which had an interesting take on it. They were talking a lot about like the gaslighting of Nancy, of how like, oh, this isn't real, get out of your head, or this is all in your head. And it's ironic because in a sense, yes, it is all in her head. In a sense, that's where Freddy is attacking you. But for this person, it was about how the dangers of the subconscious are still real. And here it is. It was Only a Dream, Exploring the Unconscious in A Nightmare on Elm Street, written by, I don't see the author's name on the article, but it'll be in the show notes. So for them, the ending was reflecting on how simply confronting your unconscious isn't always enough. That, yes, that is something you can do, but it takes more work. It takes more effort. You can't just will it away. That if the issues in your subconscious are real, then how do you defend against that? And the answer is therapy and medication.
I love that at one point Nancy's mom is talking to Nancy's dad, and Nancy's dad is like, she needs to, I forget what he gives some really bad advice, and then Nancy's mom is like, no, I'm getting her real help. We're gonna go see fucking doctors. I'm like, yeah, you are. There you go. That's a good way to look at stuff. I was like, well, I do want to move us on to the next film. We've been talking about this one for a bit. I'm sure more will come out during the comparisons phase.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, before we go back into our analysis of these films and the communities within, let's get to know Emily a little bit better. So, Emily was just telling us at the break, we take a pee break halfway through these things because, geez, we talk for a long time, that she is heading off to Panic Fest relatively soon because she has 3 movies in the festival, which is crazy. And are you doing something different in all 3 of these movies? You do like every area of film at this point, which is really exciting.
I do. I'm trying to do less, but yeah, it's pretty crazy. I'm involved in 3 films that are all playing the festival, and I've never been to Panic Fest before, so I'm really excited. Yeah, it's April 4th through 10th. And funnily enough, they're going to have Heather Langenkamp there for the 40th anniversary for the film we just talked about.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that just happens to be the 40th anniversary. It's crazy. Yeah, but I'm involved in 3 amazing films that are playing the festival. So I am an executive producer of Zishan Yunus's film, The Build Out, beautiful high desert genre film starring Jenna Cannell and Hannah Eileen. It's a beautiful film, and I'm so pleased to work with this team. They're so talented. So I'm involved with that. I'm also in Jill's new film, Jill 6, she typically goes by professionally. She directed The Stylist, which is so great. And I'm fortunate to play one of the leading characters in her next feature called Ghost Game. I star in it with Michael C. Williams from the Blair Witch Project, plays my husband. And he's great. And actually, Eduardo Sanchez, who directed The Blair Witch, EP'd this film. So we got to know Ed really well. And it's going to be a really fun and thrilling follow-up to The Stylist. It's very different. Yeah, it was thrilling to film. We shot last year in Maryland, and I can't wait to see how it turned out. And then I'm also in a short film called The Thaw, directed by Sean Temple and Sarah Weisner. We shot Toby Poser plays my mom in it, and it's a black and white period piece set in Vermont, and I play Ruth. I come home to find my parents in the middle of winter. We don't have enough food to make it through the winter, so we basically do this old urban legend that was told in Vermont for years, where you would freeze family members and then thaw them in the spring. And then, of course, something goes terribly wrong.
I feel like that just happens to me anyway. I just thaw in the spring and freeze in the winter. That's just my natural state.
Trying to thaw. More snow is coming my way soon. But it should be really fun. I mean, Panic Fest, I've never been, but the programmers are so cool. And yeah, it sounds really fun. Joe Lynch is going to be there. Yeah, it should
sounds
be
like a
fun.
great
Nice.
fest. Oh, that
So
sounds
if
so
any of
exciting.
our listeners are going to Panic Fest, then look out for those movies and say hi to Emily.
Yeah.
Yeah, say hi.
Emily, I did want to ask, because we ask all our guests this, but I am so curious how you got into horror. I remember, do you remember meeting at Fantasia Fest? I think it
Oh,
was,
yeah.
was that your first year there when we
Oh,
met?
yeah. That was my first year. That was the first time I realized there was a horror community.
Yeah.
Was at the 2019 Fantasia.
Yeah, I remember this being our conversation because I remember meeting you and you were so excited to because everyone there is so nice and so friendly. And I had the same experience there where I was like, wait, there's a horror community and we're all like the same and we like the same things and we don't have to hide our weird obsession with these movies.
No, I had the same feeling. I had no idea. I thought I was just the weirdo who was sitting in my room just being like, "Oh, I want to tell all these dark stories and I don't know what to do with my feelings."
Yes.
And it's funny because like I said, I've always loved Shakespeare, but I've always loved the really dark plays of Shakespeare. I've always been drawn to darker literature and darker movies in general. And I had directed my first kind of bigger short film called Lovers, which is on Alter. And it was making the festival rounds, but I was I didn't know what I was doing really. And my composer, Darren Callahan, introduced me to Jen Wexler, who obviously everyone knows. And Jen and I are dear friends now. But I would go get coffee with Jen sporadically in 2018, 2019. I was just so inspired by her. And I was like, Jen, what do I do? I want to get to know more filmmakers. And she was like, you know what? Just come to Fantasia with me. So I road tripped with her and Chris Scotchtapel, both from Glass Eye Pix. And we drove from New York City all the way up to Canada. And I felt like the world opened up. That was truly the most magical experience.
Oh, yeah. So I'm curious why you were drawn to these two horror films. Because for listeners, we give a list of films to our guests and they can choose or they can pitch us on something. And Emily actually pitched us on something. So I was curious why you were drawn to these themes, why this one specifically.
Yeah, the theme that I brought up, and thank you for being receptive to it, it was the pros, cons, and effects of creating a false sense of security in a community. I remember we were kind of emailing back and forth. And this topic doesn't necessarily have to do, although it kind of does on the film that I just wrapped and I'm in post in now. It has to do with a couple projects that I'm working on now. One is a film and another I can't really talk about very much, but they both have to do with, they're both kind of period pieces. They don't take place right now, but they do focus on the American ideal and the breakdown of that and the darkness beneath that. And I was really curious to dive into post 9/11 America and the effects, the results of that in film culture. How did we process that, whether it's through allegory or direct commentary? What did that do to us as a society, breaking down the idea of the American dream? And how you can't repress the subconscious, or you can, but you can only do it for so long. I wanted to explore themes of the boogeyman, the danger hiding in plain sight, the perfection, and the degradation of what seems perfect on the surface. So
Yeah. And I think these fit perfectly. We're going to touch on a lot more of that in our next film. Before we move on to our next film, I do just want to ask, before people click away, where they can find you and your work and look out for these upcoming projects that you have that hit on the themes that we're talking about today.
Sure. I'm on Instagram probably too much. On there, I'm at Emily R. Bennett. That's the site I use mostly on social. And then my website is www.emilyreneebennett.com. Yeah, and hopefully some press releases will be coming out later this year and I'll have some fun stuff to announce. But those are good places to, probably my Instagram though.
Yeah, she does have a really good active Instagram full of spooky things and a lot of support. I find so many filmmakers and people to love in the community through Emily's Instagram. So give her a follow for sure. And we'll link those in the show notes for everybody. Well, thank you again, Emily, for being here. Let's get back into our second movie because I think you'll have a lot more to say on this specific film. David, why don't you intro us?
Ivy and Lucius are in love. Growing up in the same 19th century style settlement, they've known each other and each other's families their whole lives. Ivy is a blind woman but sees colors that show the world symbolically rather than literally, and Lucius is a quiet but fearless young man who has been speaking up about the village's policies. They must never venture into the woods. Creatures, those we do not speak of, lurk among the trees and must not be provoked. Villagers must avoid the color red. It is the bad color and makes the monsters angry. Yellow, on the other hand, is the safe color. Lucius believes those we do not speak of will not attack him if he ventures through the woods into the towns, gathering important resources like medicine that could have saved a local boy's life. The elders, however, will not budge. The towns are full of nothing but wicked, corrupt people, which is why they came here in the first place. But things become more urgent soon. Ivy's intellectually disabled friend Noah stabs Lucius in a fit of jealousy. Desperate to save her lover, Ivy now takes it upon herself to complete Lucius's mission. Her father at last agrees and reveals to Ivy the village's terrible secret. Spoilers for a 20-year-old movie. Those we do not speak of do not exist. They are a fictitious boogeyman invented by the elders, inspired by folklore to keep their children safe in this bubble, protected from the outside world. A world where it is 2004, where Ivy's father paid off individuals to keep people out of the woods. A world where the elders all experienced great tragedy and chose to retreat back into the simpler times of the past. But as Ivy ventures off, Noah pursues her. Donning one of the monster costumes, he attacks but winds up plunging to his death. Ivy is aided by a kind highway patrolman and then returns home with the medicine to save Lucius. The elders discuss how Noah's death need not be in vain. If they blame it on the creatures, they can keep the myth alive a bit longer and preserve the village. Written and directed by my hero, M. Night Shyamalan.
Is that what the M stands for? My hero?
Yes.
Sorry. I never knew that.
My hero, Night Shyamalan. This movie was, I think, so definitive of my, I don't want to say childhood, of my youth. I think I remember literally everything about this movie. I was so obsessed with it. And I think a lot of it came from Ivy. I think like her character was so cool to see on screen. And I love she was so powerful in her own right. But, you know, something that's really unique about this film is that the main character, Ivy, is blind. Why do you think that choice was made?
I think Ivy has to be blind to see past the tactics used on everyone else. I think she needs a different perspective, literally. She can't see red, right? She knows the concept of red. She knows the warning signs. She knows that red is bad, but she can't see it. And so that visual cue of danger literally cannot work on her. And I think that's why she's ultimately able to move past the smoke and mirrors that the well-meaning elders thrust upon the society.
Yeah. I find it interesting because she has a line at some point where she tells Lucius, I can see the world, just not the same way that you do. Mm-hmm. And she does talk about how like she sees people as colors, that everyone has a unique color, and it's I think that counts as synesthesia, which is such an interesting character trait. I almost wish they'd used it more. That like at the end of the movie, there was a missed opportunity for her to recognize her attacker through beneath the mask because she's not seeing the costume, she's seeing the color that represents the person. But
I like that.
I think that a lot of it is also just, it's to make her an outcast. And Lucius is also an outcast because of he doesn't fall for the same tricks that the rest of the village is. Noah is also an outcast because of his very poorly represented intellectual disability.
Yeah, I find it. I'm trying not to say interesting too much on this podcast, but I find it interesting because I do it every single time. This community that Edward and the elders made, they made it in mind for themselves and their children, but they're very limited in their view, I think,
Mm.
where it becomes very clear that they didn't necessarily have in mind people like Lucius Noah and Ivy, in terms of the structure of their society, and their ideal society that they have built really is challenged when people like this enter the space. And I mean, we can debate whether or not they do it well. Um, but I think it is needed to see, people who are different to really challenge the groupthink that is created in quote unquote the village. But they are outcasts. And they aren't othered, which is not how the village is. The village others other people. Is this making sense?
It does. It's because while they are different, they are still accepted by their
Yes,
society.
exactly.
People aren't like particularly mean to them or anything like that. There are certain activities that they're not able to engage in as thoroughly, but they are still treated as humans. So in that sense, it almost, at least in the early parts of the movie, feels like, oh, the society is actually very tolerant, it's very accepting. It does show that. But then as it goes on, that veil is kind of lifted, and we do see how they are still affected, even if it's not immediately clear. And I love that you used the word othering, because that is totally a thing in this movie, that it others this fictional creatures in the woods. It also others the town people.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this, you mentioned 9/11 when we were doing our discussion between the movies, Emily. Do you guys think this movie is a response to 9/11?
I mean, I think it's a pretty universal allegory that I think fits post 9/11. I don't think it's necessarily speaking directly to that necessarily, but the themes in the village certainly speak to that reaction of, I mean, we talked about the Patriot Act and the very heightened sense of security in post 9/11, and the idea of the other, right? It became, if you see something, say something. If you see red, say something. If you or destroy it. It really heightened that sense of close your borders, lock your doors. The evil is at the gate. And we have drills that we teach children. If the bad guy comes, this is what you do. And similarly to Nightmare on Elm Street, it gives a clear bad guy when in fact life is so much more complicated than that. Yeah, but I think the village, the elders, in a way, it's very sad because they do go through something terrible in the outside world, and this is their answer. And
yeah,
I think they do have, I think it's a really good exploration of people having good intentions and the evil that can still come from that.
Yeah, there's a tragedy there that is, no matter what you do, there's still something out of your control that will inhibit you from succeeding in a pure happiness or the utopia that they are trying to create here. Yeah, it does it say. I mean, like in that there's questions around like, is humanity inherently, well, in this case, violent? Because I think violence is ever present in the village. And David, I swear that this circles back to 9/11. Um, because every single one of the elders' family members have died at the hands of violence specifically. It's not like someone got in an accident. They were all murdered pretty horribly.
Yeah, I agree. And it's I mean, to go over 9/11, obviously it was the Twin Towers were destroyed and a lot of lives were lost. This is an American movie, and America's response to this was, out of this grief and tragedy, to go to war in Iraq, which wasn't even actually involved in 9/11. And to create this monster, which was, at that time, it was just brown people, it was Muslim people, and just say they're all these terrorists that we need to take all these precautions against. And I mean, we can have a political debate all we want, but I would argue that none of that was healthy.
Right. No, so much of it was based in fear. And as you were saying, the fear that was created
Yeah.
during it is a moral panic. It was very much a moral
Yeah.
panic that was created. And that fear itself, led to overcompensating possibly, which is kind of what I'm seeing in The Village. It's a response to this very tragic thing that happened in our lives. In order to compensate for that, let's just say fuck all of society. I have a billion acres in Pennsylvania because I'm a rich ass dude. Let's pay planes not to fly over there, and let's just pretend like we're in the 1880s again. Why not?
And the movie, I think, does also deconstruct that quite a bit as well, because when Ivy finally does go to the outside world, the only person that she actually interacts with is this benevolent person who just hears, oh, someone's in trouble? Okay, well, here's some medicines that you can help him.
I
I
know.
won't spill your secret to anyone. I won't tell people about you. You can stay secret if you want. And it's like, what? Okay, great. That's not at all what I was told you would be like. She even says, oh, I didn't expect you to be kind. That surprises me.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even
Mm.
think about that. That scene always like hits me, and I always thought it was because of this amazing performance by this character, by this actor who like literally did nothing else. I just loved it so much. I loved him so much. But I think you're right. It's the shock of, oh, he's so nice. Like humans
Yeah.
aren't supposed to be nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, and I think moral panic and the idea of us and them is so prevalent in both of these films, right?
Mhm.
Because psychologically, it's so interesting. If you give a group of people someone to fear or hate, those relationships form very quickly when you have a common enemy. That's why people go to sports games and people get, an election year. Like we know what's coming. Like both sides will argue because both sides have a clear enemy, right? And I
Mhm.
think this here, like the idea of us and them, it forms very strong, immediate bonds
Yeah.
that people don't question. And I think the reason that the slightly different community members, Ivy, Lucius, Noah, the thing they have in common is that they are falling in line.
Yeah.
And it kind of doesn't matter if they are different as long as they're doing the same thing. I was actually, God, earlier today, I'm watching The Vow on
Oh
HBO.
God. Oh.
Oh, and I mean, I've actually had to slowly work through it because it's
Yeah.
very
Are you on season
troubling.
2? Because that one take
Yeah,
your time with. Yeah.
yeah, I'm having to. I think the idea of cults and bonds that are formed in that, I've encountered various circumstances similar, like cult-like figures in my life. Like I said, I grew up in the church, and so
Mm.
I do find cults fascinating, and I find leaders of cults fascinating, terrifying, but fascinating nonetheless. And I think for good or for bad, this is a kind of cult, right? The Village is a kind of cult.
Yeah, I agree. There was a political theorist slash Nazi named Carl Schmitt who
Oh,
basically wrote about identity politics, and his argument was that all politics are identity politics, that we aren't really capable of thinking of things in a nuanced way, and everything will always come down to us versus them.
Mhm.
And in some ways, I kind of agree with him to a certain extent. I mean, there is a certain point at which it's much easier to just refer to our quick frame of reference and say, oh, well, this idea is supported by the political party that I'm not affiliated with, therefore it's bad because I'm not one of them, I'm one of us. And that also applies to dealings with race, religion, etc., etc. And Schmidt used this as justification for becoming a Nazi because he said that he wanted to be part of the us and not the them, and created
oh,
a them.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes really dangerous. It's hard because in the village, there's kind of two us and thems going on, right? Like there's the village where the us is everyone inside the village, and then them are the creatures outside and
Yes.
maybe the towns, but specifically the creatures. But then when we come to the end, we realize that the us is still the village, but the them is society. And like when you look at it, at like the history of the village, it's kind of Edward going, you know what? I just fuck the world. Just like fuck literally everybody else. I am the one who knows better and I am the one who knows how to solve this problem. It's me versus them kind of. Which I think like plays more into that cult mentality of no, I am the Messiah. I have the answers for utopia and you should follow me because I can provide this better life for you. It is kind of more singular. And this is me just challenging the theories here. I don't know how I specifically feel about Edward myself, but I do. There is a really wonderfully conflicting character trait when he decides himself to tell Ivy the secret of the town and does not confide in the rest of the elders. And they have built this community on, they very much share the ownership of it. They alternate who's leading the meetings, every meeting. Like they're very much seen as a collective leadership, but then he makes a decision without them, and one that is pretty dire. I mean, it's the entire secret of the town. And again, it's a me versus everybody else. I know what's better.
Well, I think I agree with you to an extent, but I also think that that's some ways the opposite. I think that decision is made because he's doubting. I think that that this is the right thing. That you think of his argument is that we did this whole thing to protect innocence. We did this to protect our children, and now they're in danger. Lucius is literally dying, and it's relevant here to remember that couple weeks before this, Brendan Gleeson's son died of some illness that modern medicine could have dealt with. Like, he did not need to die. He died because they have isolated themselves, because they've decided that everyone else is the enemy. And I think that Edward is somewhat opening himself up to what Lucius and Ivy are arguing, that we can't be this isolated. And then when everyone freaks out at the end of the movie, he doesn't make a decision. He says, oh, well, we could use Noah's death to keep the village alive. Is that what you want to do?
Yes. I mean, that was lucky. But from that, I do question, like, when should the rules be broken in this sense?
Yeah.
As you said, he didn't break the rules when the child died. He didn't break the rules when Ivy lost her sight. He openly admitted that if he did get medicine from the outside worlds, maybe she could have been cured. And then they do like somehow refer to Noah possibly being able to be cured from outside medicine, which like, okay.
That's not.
Yeah.
This M. Night Shyamalan does not have a great history of depicting intellectual disabilities and mental illnesses. We notice. We've talked about these issues in other episodes. Yeah, it's having an intellectual disability does not make you violent.
Yeah, it's a combination here for sure. But going back, it's just, what is the purpose of the rules if they are allowed to be broken? And is that not then the downfall? Like, is it the downfall of the society, or do you see it as a society improving and growing?
It's difficult because the village, while well-intentioned, I don't think is necessarily good, just because this us and them mentality allows you to not focus on the self and the individual, and I mean literally healing with medicine from the outside world. You can't be an island. The true answer here is not, it's not necessarily looking at the village as the collapse of society, because society is so much bigger than the village ultimately, and it's not filled with terrible people. It's filled with kindly park rangers who will help you and like not tell your secret. And I mean, I think the idea that the village is the only society is the flaw in the paradigm. That is not the world. The world is so much bigger than the village. And I think that's the realization. Ultimately, William Hurt has to pry his cold, dead fingers off of this control and admit there is more out there, and maybe I don't know everything. And I think that's the best decision anyone makes in the film, I think, is saying this thing that I thought was perfect might not be perfect. I think that is the most human wonderful reaction to any of this, of saying, maybe I did cause this. Maybe all humans are capable of violence. Maybe everyone is capable of good. And what if we just take away this us and them and say, it's just us and we have to deal with us?
Yeah, because even when they find an attempted murderer in their midst in Noah, they treat him differently. There isn't like a big punishment for him, or at least not that we've seen. You know, he just gets locked in a room, and I don't think we really get to see how they are going to deal with him, honestly, or deal with it in the society of addressing this act of violence.
Yeah, and it's not like when Noah does that, they torture him. He's one of them. And so their answer is to lock him away, is to, put him behind a closed door and say, well, maybe if we just like don't talk about this for a while, maybe, maybe we'll forget. Like, I don't know. It's that act of repression of holding on to those ideals of saying, but not us. We're the good ones. We are us. They are them. I mean, if we're looking at this as a big metaphor, that repression will get out. That repression will put on that grotesque cloak and come and find you. And ultimately you have, literally, like, you have to confront this repressed part of yourself. You have to look at yourself square in the face and say, and I actually believe this fully. I believe everyone is capable of violence. I believe everyone is capable of deep empathy and love. Like, I think that's what's so interesting about humans, and what's so interesting about drama and film is watching someone at the beginning of a film and seeing what they turn into and what they do, whether great or terrible. And I think this society has just white knuckled this existence so much that they can't begin to admit that one of them could do something wrong.
Yeah, I love all of that.
Yeah.
Even aside from the violence, I would even just question their glamorization of the past. This village is kind of built on this idea that, oh, it is make America great again. It's that we used to be so much better, and now we're all violent and horrible things happen. So we should go back to this time where we lived in a close-knit community and not think about the inevitable inbreeding if we last long enough.
Well, it goes to what Emily was saying of they only see what they want to see. They only see what reinforces their beliefs, right? They repress everything else. One would say they are blind to how certain people lived. Oh,
full
what?
circle.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, like, it makes so much sense that this is an all-white cast, because that's the only way that they would want to live this way.
Yeah. Yeah. We touched on it a little bit, but there's definitely a lot of privilege in this film.
Yep.
Now that our conversation talking about, just like as I was saying, like what they're blind to and how certain people lived, I think it could also be read as a commentary on the wealthy and, glamorization of the working class, or just like, I mean, bringing it back to the suburbs, the grass is always greener mentality of, well, the past had it better, or the people who lived a simpler life have it better. They don't have all these issues that comes with money, which is kind of literally what Edward said. He said money comes with all these issues and all this violence. And actually going even further into that, David, at the beginning of Nightmare, you were saying, the suburbs were a turn of the century idea, and this village takes place in the 1880s. And guiding us into a comparison section and kind of just opening this up, the village was made 20 years after Nightmare on Elm Street. This is a 2004 movie. Nightmare on Elm Street was 1984. And the village actually kind of takes place around the time of Nightmare on Elm Street originally, because the parents are from the 70s, and that is when they decide to build the village around the same time that Nightmare on Elm Street was coming out. So there's this interesting comparison, I think, directly with what was happening to the parents in the late 1970s to early 80s and how they were reacting to America at that time is also reflective on what's happening in Nightmare on Elm Street and what Wes Craven is commenting on.
Do you think any of the village elders were in the mob that killed Freddy Kreuger?
I was just thinking that.
They are the mob.
It ties together. It all connects.
Oh man, there should be a sequel to The Village where Freddy Kreuger is haunting all the kids.
Oh, crossover. Oh, that'd be so good.
Nightmare in the Village.
Every town has an Elm Street.
It's true.
Every village has an Elm Street. Sorry.
Oh my God, that's the tagline.
Every village has
Every
an Elm
village.
Street. Oh man.
Oh, that's great.
Um,
I mean, they have so much in common. I think the idea of us and them, the gaslighting of the younger generation, the needing to control with idealism compared to like the evil that is outside. And I wrote basically Nightmare on Elm Street. I think it explores the horrors of the repressed subconscious, and The Village explores the horrors of the repressed society. But I think they kind of both do both in a way.
Yeah.
They're both films about repression and keeping truth at bay, you know, reaching towards the American dream, whether it's in the 1800s or in the 1980s.
Yeah. And even in the 1980s, we talked about how they're glamorizing the 1950s.
Yeah.
Which were not
that's
actually an ideal time, no matter what the movies and television told you.
Again, a white American dream before the revolutions of the 60s. Oh my God. Oh my God.
It's so interesting. Like people who really fetishize in a way, that might be a bit of a rough word for it, but fetishize the past, I think is so interesting because the past, I don't know, it's impossible to live that way because of what we know. Like it's actually impossible. And so it's that the reaching for that is always so, but they're hiding. They're still hiding. Both of these films are an older generation in control of the society, hiding desperately from themselves.
Yeah, 1000%. And doing it in a way, I mean, just to keep repeating the us versus them, but they create a physical monster in both of these. You know, there's an argument to be said that Nightmare on Elm Street is a fairy tale and that The Village also is creating an urban legend or a folk tale. In fact, the trailer for Nightmare on Elm Street says it's a fairy tale, which is really interesting. And I was reading a little bit into that and looking at the past and seeing like, yeah, I mean, the basis of a fairy tale is that and urban legends as well is a community or parents creating this story in order to keep children in line, right? Or creating a monster in order to teach a lesson to the child to make them do what they think is the right thing, right? Whether it be, you know, don't stay up past your bedtime because the boogeyman is going to get you from your closet, you know, which is literally Nightmare on Elm Street, actually, now that I think about it.
Well, actually, Nightmare on Elm Street, it's do stay up past your bedtime.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, fairy tales are always about teaching lessons through fear, right?
Yeah, through fear.
Little Red Riding Hood is don't talk to strangers because they might eat you and your grandmother. What are other fairy tales?
No, Little Red Riding Hood is like the perfect one because the red cloak that we're talking about. No, it's true. All fairy tales, they do operate on a level of fear as like a cautionary tale in a way. And urban legends do a similar thing. I know growing up, you always heard about like the couple at makeout point or whatever. And then she's like, oh, I hear a scratching. And they're like, oh, well, and she's like, no, I need to go home. And so the guy takes her home and there's a hook in the side of the window, the mirror, and the killer was out there the whole time. And if only you didn't make out with your boyfriend and make out point, you wouldn't be in danger. Like I think both kind of they feed each other. I feel like fairy tale feels like an older idea and term, and urban legend feels more city, obviously. Like the word urban is literally in it. But they are dealing with lessons to younger generations about fear, based on fear.
Yeah.
And I don't think being ruled or governed by fear is healthy. I love horror films, but I don't think raising a society or children based on fear, it can ultimately help them. It will honestly, it will only force them to repress and to feel othered themselves. Then the self starts to repress, and you get into nightmares, and you have to work for years to kind of grow out of that fear. So yeah, it's only through facing your fears can you kind of grow.
Right. There are unseen results from that of living in the fear. we then suffer our own traumas. The children then suffer a different trauma, and we see kind of like this cycle. And I think you're right. Like, it comes from a place of wanting to protect these children, but I guess ultimately, do these films support what you're saying, Emily, that it is not good to rule by fear, even if it does come from a good place? Or are they saying no, like we should protect our children, we should create these monsters to keep them in line and to ensure what we think is a safer future?
Well, it's interesting because, like, we passed off as a joke, but fairy tales say don't stay up past your bedtime. Nightmare on Elm Street says do stay up past your bedtime. Nightmare on Elm Street, through everything that we were discussing when we were talking about, is kind of deconstructing these notions that the lock your door doesn't work, grab your crucifix doesn't work, better stay up late doesn't work, and the only thing you really can do is face it. The Village also, they're creating all of these rules, but we're shown how it's restricting society, how it's repressing the people in it, how the children are not actually living the better life that their parents dreamed for them, and they're constantly in danger. It's showing you how creating these restrictions is not necessarily good. In one movie, the restrictions are done by saying the boogeyman is real, and the other one it's by saying the boogeyman is not real. It's lies.
Well, and I think to piggyback off what you're saying, David, I think in a way, I feel like the real question here is not, is a society based on fear good or bad? I think ultimately both of these films are saying it doesn't matter because it can't last. Someone in this society will break out inevitably and leave and transgress.
Yeah.
Ultimately, someone will become brave.
I feel like a lot of critics of The Village, not necessarily all of them, but I think there's a line of argument where people like to point out plot holes, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, what would the elders do? What about when all the elders die? If no one else knows, how do you keep this idea alive? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's the point. it doesn't work. Like, there are so many very carefully balanced things in this movie, in this idea, that the movie is telling you outright, like, there's so many things that can go wrong. They can't keep this secret. The secret will get out sooner or later, whether that lasts until all the elders die and then people are like, what happened to those we don't talk about, where are they? Or if it's because he runs out of money and then planes start running overhead and they point up and they say, what the fuck are those dragons up there?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a really wonderful place. We're coming up on time here, but so many wonderful things were said. Does anyone have any last thoughts about either of these films before we move on to the review section? Great.
Yeah, all right. So now it's time for Rob's favorite part of the show, the bone review section, where we rate each film on a scale of 1 to 4 bones. Starting us off this week is Devin with A Nightmare on Elm Street.
A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is a solid 3-bone movie for me. I like this movie a lot, a lot, a lot. I don't love it to the point where I want to fully give it 4 bones, but like this movie, I mean, it's just Wes Craven at his best. It's scary, it's thought provoking, but it's also like super goofy, which is so perfect and so emblematic of the 80s and everything that I like about 80s horror. Obviously, Robert Englund is the best and he gives an amazing performance. We don't have to go on and on about him. It's fine. I will reserve that for my own dreams and not nightmares. The other thing I that came out in this watch for me is the music is so good. I think there is so much that, like, the effects are so good. There is so much about the craft of filmmaking in this film that really makes it a classic, obviously. Yeah, I'm keeping this one short. 3 bones for me. Emily, would you grace us with your bone rating?
So looking at it in the context of when the film was made, kind of what was happening. I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite slasher. It's like my favorite, like, of the 80s, kind of this heyday of Nightmare, Friday the 13th, Halloween. Like, it's my favorite. And I think I feel a spiritual kinship with Wes Craven, again, having been raised in the Bible Belt myself. I love his point of view as an outsider. And so I think just within the context of when it was made, and exactly what you said, Devin, the filmmaking craft behind it, the turning rooms, the set that they had to build to do the tub shot, just literally like mounting the camera and having the room turn Tina over and why is she on the ceiling? It's so good. And it's a goofy, like looking at it now, it's super goofy. And obviously I don't find it terrifying, but Freddy Kreuger is the Mac Daddy. He's the classic. And for that reason, I'm going to give it 4. I love Nightmare on Elm
damn.
Street.
Amazing. To me, the scariest moment in the movie, or creepiest moment perhaps, is at one point, I forget which point it is now, but after she comes back to the real world after fighting Freddy, and he was like doing pillow stuff and there were feathers flying everywhere. And when she's back in the real world, at the end of the scene, you just see one small feather floating in the background. And watching that whenever I first saw the movie, that was like the creepiest part. I was like, that's awesome. This movie is brilliant. I don't think it's my favorite slasher movie, but it's probably my favorite slasher franchise aside from maybe Scream, also Wes Craven. I think all of the movies that have Robert Englund in them are at least good. I love it so much. And there are multiple amazing movies. And this is one of the best in the franchise. I go back and forth of which one's my favorite. Nancy is probably the best final girl. I really love Nancy. I like how she's very active. She doesn't wait around. She is aware of the threat. She is investigating. She is trying to figure out how to combat this. When one thing doesn't work, she tries a different thing, and she somewhat overcomes Freddy just by outsmarting, by staying on her feet, and she creates a worthy protagonist to fight this unstoppable monster. That the fear is not because she's dumb, the fear is because he is just that freaking powerful. Brilliant effects. This movie was actually a reference for my short film Pillow Talk, which is now streaming on YouTube, link in the description. Specifically the part where Rod is hanged in his cell and the blanket wraps around his neck. Researching how they did that shot went into my short film, and we just did like the poor man's version of the same way. Yeah, amazing movie. If I had to be critical for a moment, the ending doesn't fully work for me. I think it's a little weird. So it's a near perfect movie. I'm giving it 3.5 bones.
Nice.
That's totally fair.
How about The Village, Devin?
Yeah, it's funny. I said this movie meant so much to me in my youth, and I really do still feel that way. And then there was like my past views on it, or like in the past 10 years, I got bored. But this viewing of me like really like brought back that love of this movie. I was just so into it. I do think it's a really strong film from M. Night, specifically with the direction. And I mean, the cast really is wonderful. I think they bring so much to these characters. There's so much inner conflict with their character and with the story. And this cast is also insane. Like you forget who's in it. Michael Pitt, Jesse Eisenberg, Fran Kranz. Yeah, Brendan Gleeson, I completely forgot was in this
Sigourney
movie.
Weaver.
Like what the fuck? Sigourney Weaver. I mean, obviously Joaquin Phoenix and Bryce Dallas Howard and Adrian Brody. Like it goes on and on and on. Roger Deakins did the cinematography. It's like the brilliant people behind this movie, I think, is what makes it really strong. The score is amazing. The story is really unique. There's one scene that I didn't get to bring up, and I just want to bring up here as an example of why I think it's a strong movie for direction for M. Night. And it's this simple, basically one shot that's an introduction to the village, is when these two girls who are not main characters are sweeping the porch and they're having fun and they're playing around, and they see a red flower, and then they get so scared and go back to their work and with just like this terror in their eyes. There's not a single word said in that scene, but it's just the way that themes are presented through the action, I think like really does show how wonderful this movie is. And it's scary. I was always so scared of it. So this is a 3.5 bone movie for me. I think this is a really wonderful film and one to revisit. I know it's high. I did not expect to rate it that high, but again, I liked this viewing. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, I'm a little envious of both of you guys growing up on this film because I didn't. I somehow missed it. Like, I saw a ton of M. Night films when I was a kid, but I somehow never saw this one. So I don't have those memories of it that I think would probably place it a little higher in my mind. I watched it several years ago, again, I think during the pandemic when I was just watching a ton of films. And I mean, I can't disagree. The cast is insanity in this. It's just powerhouse. Cherry Jones, like it's powerhouse after powerhouse. It's just Jesse Eisenberg has like one line, and I'm like, that's Jesse Eisenberg. Like, what the hell? The stoner from Cabin in the Woods. It is ultimately Judy Greer's guy, right? It's just so fun to watch. It's Roger Deakins. I mean, come on, it's great. Like, the pieces are there of a great film. I think it's brilliant filmmaking. But I have to say, watching it, and this is my second watch, knowing what the twist is, and again, I didn't the first time I watched it. I was like, oh, okay, cool. I don't know how I missed that, but I didn't see that necessarily coming. I'm a very gullible audience member, and I love that. But this time, knowing where this is coming from, knowing there is no monster, knowing that this is much more of a social commentary film told with beautiful craft and beautiful performances. Every department is working at the top of their game. It ultimately just kind of falls a little flat for me. And yeah, I wish I could rate it higher. Yeah, I would say, just because I do love M. Night Shyamalan and I respect him so much as a filmmaker, I think he's just trod upon too much. Like, I think he's so good. I'll give it a 2.5 just because, and again, I would love to put this higher. The Sixth Sense is just a perfect movie in my mind. And I hate rating any, just as a filmmaker, I'm just like, I hate not giving perfect scores to every film because I just empathize and sympathize with all filmmakers. So 2.5, but that's like really low for me. So I feel kind of bad for saying that, but it's still a great film.
You don't need to feel bad. It's fine. There are a lot of problems in the movie. I think the first 15 minutes could just be cut and you wouldn't really lose anything. It takes 15 minutes to introduce Bryce Dallas Howard. Like, she's the main character, and nothing really happens in those first 15 minutes. The pacing of the movie is a little odd. Like, this is definitely a flawed movie. I like the main characters, but I do think they're a little too perfect, maybe. I'm definitely critical of the mental health depictions with Noah. I kind of wish they were more specific in why the elders decided to do this. Like, they all seem to have different reasons. Some of them quote violence primarily, some of them are primarily quoting greed, and it's like, just pick a lane there a little bit. The violence one is probably more interesting, but I still really like it as well. And I think that despite its flaws, I mean, I mentioned how people are always complaining about plot holes. I don't care about plot holes. If you're complaining about plot holes, it's because the movie isn't working for you, and that's fine. But the movie's so interesting, and it's so much more than its twist. The twist, I like the twist. It arguably might have been better if she came onto the other side of the wall and was in like the sprawling streets of Philadelphia or whatever, and just getting that stark contrast with like a big city where you're in the middle of all society. But at the same time, the way it's presented right now is kind of a bit of an intentional anticlimax. And I've seen reviews where people talk about how the movie is anticlimactic, and I'm like, well, yeah, but I like that. I like that it's kind of anticlimactic and it just reaches its end point and you're just left to ponder it. Like, it is such a complex film. Also, the red is the bad color, yellow is the safe color is kind of an analogy to 9/11 as well. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but just the threat level red was the bad thing. Threat level yellow like became the baseline, because even though that's not safe, it's apparently there was like not a lot of information about how those threat levels were determined, which is so mind-boggling to me because I always just assume they were correct and accurate, and then it's like, oh no, this is really subjective and these are like guesses and we don't even know what criteria they're using to decide on these. And I'm like, oh, okay. In its analogy to 9/11, the village might be better because the people are at least well-intentioned, and I don't give the same credit to the politicians making decisions after 9/11. But aside from that, it's fascinating to see it from that angle. I think the movie is so complex and beautifully shot. Roger Deakins, amazing. Shyamalan's direction, also amazing. I love how they use Ivy's blindness and how they depict that on screen with these really interesting angles that like keep things out of focus, or that look at her but obscure other details. Like it's really well shot and just a gorgeous movie. I'm also giving it 2.5 bones. I love M. Night Shyamalan. M. Night Shyamalan was one of the first directors who I got really, really into in high school. I love M. Night Shyamalan, and The Village is great.
Everything changes when you have a history with it, I feel like. Yeah. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us for this conversation around community and individualism and the effects of moral panics in A Nightmare on Elm Street and The Village. And thank you to our lovely guest, Emily Bennett. Emily, once again, where can people find you to find the work that is currently out? Because there's a lot, as well as the work that's coming down the line.
Again, Instagram is probably the best way to see like what I'm up to. I'm at Emily R. Bennett, and then my website is updated pretty regularly, emilyreneebennett.com. Yeah, I'll be announcing some exciting stuff later this year. And Panic Fest, woo! Everybody get to Kansas City and come see some horror films with us.
It'll be a great time. And if you can't make it to Panic Fest, don't forget to watch Alone with You on Shudder, as well as Lovers on Altar, some classic films by Emily there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you guys for having me. This was so much fun.
Oh my God. So happy to have you.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for your time. And so for our listeners, what did you think of these movies? Do you think that humans are ultimately violent? Do you think that they're inherently good? Would you go and take your money and live off in the woods somewhere? Would you try to stay all awake to defeat Freddy? Let us know. We are Cadaver Dogs Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and Cadaver Dogs Podcast on TikTok, where we try to post videos sometimes. And we are also on YouTube at Cadaver Dogs Podcast. Hit us up. Until next time, Mutts.
Peace. I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.